Hello, and a very warm welcome to this Uptime Labs live stream. Today, we're going to be talking about IT incident response and how individuals and organizations can learn these skills and grow this expertise. Now, if you're watching this in the live stream, please post your questions and we'll try our best to respond during the session. If you're watching this on the recording, please feel free to leave your comments. We'd really love to hear from you and to respond to your thoughts. So I'm Stu Reimel. I work for Uptime Labs, a simulation and learning platform that helps individuals and organizations to respond more effectively to incidents. And I couldn't be more excited for today's conversation. We have three amazing guests who together bring a truly world-class depth of IT incident expertise and wisdom. And I, for one, have learned a tremendous amount from them. So first up, we have Sarah Butt, a principal engineer in the tech sector who specializes in all things incidents. Sarah has over a decade of experience wrangling incidents for large tech companies, and her experience managing high-pressure situations spans multiple industries. So before pivoting into tech, she spent 10 years working as an audio engineer and production manager for large-scale events, including festivals, Formula One, and live award shows. So she's seen a lot. Next up, we have the brilliant Morgan Collins. Morgan spent over 25 years in technology operations with a brief stint in QA, environmental management, and even bald eagle tracking, which is certainly something we don't see a lot of over my side of the pond. He's an incident management expert, most recently serving as an incident management architect for Salesforce before resigning in October to take a break and to focus on the next step in his career. And finally, we have Courtney Nash. Courtney is a former cognitive neuroscientist who has worked at companies ranging from Amazon to Microsoft, O'Reilly Media, Fastly, Verica, and now she runs The Void, a community-contributed collection of software-related incident reports aimed at making the internet a safer and more resilient place. Courtney studies failure and expertise in complex software systems, focusing on how we can bring ideas from resilience engineering into the software domain. Courtney also knows a thing or two about baking sourdough. So I'm particularly looking forward to some incident expertise and sourdough equivalents in this session. So no pressure there, Courtney. So thanks for joining us, you three. So if you're all sitting comfortably, let's start with a little bit of story time. I'd love to hear about your learning journeys. So Sarah, let's start with you. How did you start in the world of IT incidents and how did you learn?
Yeah, that's a fun question. I think when I started, I wasn't really even aware of what these concepts were. So I was coming off, as you mentioned, being an audio engineer. I was working for a tech company at the time. I was working for Dell in sales, and they were rolling out a new sales platform, and I was like the on the ground sort of advocate within the sales team. And so as you can imagine, things broke, and kind of like my platform just did, which is fine. And so I was exposed first to incident communications, and I read those, and I was fascinated by them. I got to know some people who gave me a chance to sit on the bridges and observe, which was actually not something that was normally allowed at that time. And eventually, I'd be sitting on these bridges, and I had kind of firsthand experience of what was happening, the customer experience. And so I'd ping people on the side and be like, hey, like the customer experience is this, like, and they don't know that on the bridge. And finally they're like, Sarah, just speak up, just speak up. So I guess I spoke up with enough conviction that they decided they should move me into the engineering organization and make incidents my full-time job. So I moved into that full-time. I got some training there, did that for a number of years. And then about 5 years ago, I moved to my current employer. And again, I was a product manager, so I was not in the incident space, but I found myself drawn back to it. And so started to sit on their bridges and have an opportunity to watch and learn. And then had a chance to transfer onto the team that does incidents full time. And when I was on that team, I had great advanced incident command training, actually given by another one of our panelists. I got a chance to do a number of drills and coaching and shadowing. So really a comprehensive learning journey there. And that's where I've been for the past 5 years. which is maybe a good tie over into Morgan, because Morgan is in fact the person who did a lot of my training and taught me how to be the incident commander I am.
That's awesome. So yeah, it sounds like you've experienced a number of different forms of training, from kind of classroom-like training, from coaching and mentoring to pairing. So that's great, and also you've had the pleasure of being taught by Morgan. So, how about you, Morgan? How did you get into this business?
Um, Serendipity. I started out directly out of high school. I lived in the Bay Area and started as a network operations engineer for an ISP back in 1999. And honestly, it probably took several years, I'd say maybe 2007, 2008, before I really started associating incident response as a potentially different skill set from operations. I had always just viewed it as a subset of operations at that time. But as my career progressed, I think as the industry continued to grow and get more complex, there was a growing focus on people who could respond to incidents and handle them. And eventually, that's what actually got my foot in the door uh, for my most previous job, which was being brought in as an incident response expert and someone who could help bring a level of maturity to operations. And from there, it just became an increasing specialty, and just watching how the industry and the thought leaders there adapted. Like in 2013, I would say maybe the biggest change for me was hearing a velocity keynote from the late Dr. Richard Cook and learning about some of the fundamentals of cognitive systems engineering, resilience engineering from there. And I would say probably the most recent massive leap was being part of the Snafu Catchers Consortium in the 2017-2018 timeframe, where a bunch of different tech companies came together to talk about how we learned from incidents and handled them. So I would say that's kind of how I got my foothold into this. And I've just been spending the better part of the last decade learning more about how come I'm good and trying to leverage that into helping improve those around me.
That's awesome, Morgan. Thank you. And though I have far less experience than either you, Morgan, or Sarah, in handling incidents, I've certainly handled my fair share over the years. And personally, I found it to be quite hard, and certainly quite a learning curve. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what is it about effective incident response that is hard, and how might people most effectively gain that expertise that's necessary. What do you think, Morgan?
Now, I'm going to paraphrase David Woods a little bit and comment that one of the big challenges in incident response is that the skill set you need to be good at responding to incidents is usually very similar to your day job, but it isn't actually the same skill set. So you can have people on an operations or site reliability team or development team, whatever technology group you're working with, that can be incredibly good with many different aspects of the job, but when it comes to incident response itself, may struggle for any variety of reasons. I mean, there are a lot of them, but some of them, more prevalent than the others. But I think that's probably the biggest one. Is some people who are good at incident response, again, may not understand how come they're good or what their specific skill sets are that separate them from their peers. And that can be really difficult, especially depending on how those skill sets balance. I'm being a little vague.
Feels like we lost Morgan as well.
Yeah, I'm being a little vague in general because I'd actually be really curious to hear about some of the examples from Courtney and Sarah. But I think that, like, I would say an easy low hanging fruit one is just the vast difference in pressure that can happen from an incident, because the amount of people looking at what you're doing is very different than the 95% of the time you're not on an incident. So I would highlight that as one of the biggest challenges.
I think there's something Morgan just mentioned that's really interesting. And it gets into the law of fluency concepts, which is that primarily, I think, at least in my experience, one of the ways that you learned from people who were further along in their journey and had a lot more expertise. And I had great teaching and training from those people, but they dedicated time to learning how to teach to someone at my level. And one of the things, and I'm going to shortly hand this to Courtney because she's going to explain this a lot better than I will. But part of the law of fluency is that like you've got these experts who are doing things that feel so second nature to them that they don't know how to even really articulate to people why they're doing it or how they're doing it, which makes it very hard to therefore teach people. And so you have to find ways to surface that knowledge and teach it. And then the industry's concept of good is also like can change a good bit. I think Morgan and I were talking earlier, and he had said, if you ask 3 people, you'll get 3 or 4 different answers about what a good incident response is. But I do think Courtney probably has a much better tie into like the actual cognitive science than I do on the law of fluency. So I want to hear what she's going to say.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I think Morgan highlighted something in particular, that in that the nature of the work that you do in an incident is so similar to the work you do every day, but it is different. And one of the real hallmarks of expertise is we learn by doing this kind of work. You learn from other people, as Sarah has said, right? I mean, you can read books, you can watch blog posts, you can watch people, you can shadow, but the best way to acquire that expertise is by doing it yourself. And so there's a couple things there. You don't have as many incidents as you have daily work, right? Thank God, hopefully. And so the ability to practice that even just slightly different kind of work is significantly reduced. And so it takes time, first of all, to be able to have the exposure to that, to build your own expertise in that. And then the second piece of this kind of expertise that Sarah totally nailed is that people who have a pretty high level of expertise don't really have access to why they have that or what that looks like or how to communicate that. That doesn't mean you can't. It's just not a hallmark of that kind of expertise. And there are people who learn how to introspect that kind of expertise, how to break it down, how to, be able to teach that to other folks. But as Sarah has also alluded, that is rare. And it's also not something that as an industry, I would say we have invested in as heavily as other industries that have incidents, accidents, what have you, have invested in. And so that inability to access your expertise, or like why you have it or what it looks like or how it manifests, is definitely a part of what makes this kind of work challenging, and challenging to translate to other people and to build up, and that we need to give folks the grace that it takes time to build that expertise.
Thank you, Courtney. And so what does this mean for the variety of options for learning and training for incident response skills that exist out there? So, typically, certainly I was introduced to incident response through a kind of sink or swim method. It was, here's a pager and oops, it's going off. Good luck. So there's that. And then, of course, there's mentorship and coaching, which I'm sure Sarah benefited from Morgan's mentorship and coaching there. There's pairing and shadowing where you're watching on. There's classroom training, like typical classroom based approach. And then there's also kind of experiential learning, tabletop game days, simulation like Uptime Labs does. Tell us a little bit about these different learning options and how they might help.
I'll go ahead and kick this one off. I think at the end of the day, a lot of these options are established with building a foothold in knowledge or your mental model of an environment. And that's where you'll see a lot of training programs start, whether or not that's we've had problems with databases falling over for the last 6 months. So we're going to do training around that, to you're a new person. We want you to understand our environment. So we're going to give some low level environmental training for incidents through there. And I think that honestly, again, Courtney will speak better, I think, to the industry standard, but from what I've seen and from the conversations I've had, that's about where 80% of companies actually tend to stop in terms of their training, because either the cost to invest, the cost to spend, the fact that you are often doing 2 jobs, your day job and your incident response, means that that's layered at the beginning. So one of the things I would note about companies having that challenge is at a high level, you have to look at, well, once you get beyond the entry level rote knowledge or your run books or playlists, how are you going to pivot or how you're going to elevate that? And that's where I think a lot of expertise in building this sort of training comes into play, because it can become how the organization reacts. So a quick example I'll give is a lot of trainings focused on responders or technical people or the people with the pagers, not necessarily as often to the executive staff, to the people who may be called in from a second or third range, where there's a lot of benefit there. So it becomes about organizational learning, or maybe knowledge contrasting to people who aren't on incidents every day, but have a very different model and whatnot. But I would say fundamentally, a key to success is looking beyond that initial rote area to where your performance improvements can happen.
Yeah.
I think to add on to that a little bit, so I got to experience probably all of these different methods of teaching or learning, and I do think there was value for me in all of them, and I pull from all of them in how I do my job. But I think part of it does come down to like, what are people's learning styles? And Courtney talked to this a little bit as well. Like for me, the primary ways that I learn best is by being able to watch, by being able to do, and then by being able to build out patterns in my head. And the patterns in my head gets into, I think, some of that like recognition prime decision making and NDM that if we get too far deep into, I'm going to let Morgan speak to, because he's great at speaking to it. But I do think part of that is recognizing that some other people learn differently, and being able to figure out, like, are there people that need to have reference materials they can read? Are there people that need reference materials that they can watch? But at the end of the day, and this is the part that Courtney kind of got into, is like, you have to put the learning into practice. And that's really going to either be a drill or a real incident. I feel like I was very fortunate with my training that I was part of a very robust drill program. So I didn't have the pressure of production actually being down when I was also trying to incorporate my skills from a training class at the same time. But like, if you think about like a bicycle, like you can read about someone riding a bicycle, you can watch someone ride a bicycle. At the end of the day, you have to get on the bicycle, and there are elements of balancing on a bicycle and such that there's really nothing you can do to get that until you are actually on the bicycle. So I think Morgan and Courtney probably both have things to say on that. The last thing I would say is that like, learning is continuous. For me, learning is not like okay, you've done the training program, now you're done. Like, a lot of the learning that I have now is going through prior either incidents or drills. We did a Void podcast about a drill that Alex Ellman and I did, and the insight that Eric Dobbs was able to give me about saturation that I hadn't even picked up myself as doing, like I smacked into my own law of fluency there, was really valuable. So I think there's that piece of having a feedback loop as well, particularly once you get quite fluent. But I feel like I've dangled catnip for both Courtney and Morgan, so I'm going to let them go.
Well, Sarah mentioned my favorite metaphor, which is of course bicycles, but we won't necessarily go there. But it's a perfect metaphor. So I want to kind of pull this together a little bit, because just to harken back to the point that Morgan made earlier, where this is different work than your daily work. And if companies aren't building out training specifically acknowledging that, first of all, right, that's part of an issue. I think from what I know of industry standards, no more than half of the companies I know of have dedicated incident response teams, just to start with, right? And so you are, again, expecting people to sort of hop between these two worlds, and then your training is probably not as good around that, all of that experience, what have you, right? And then, so that's one piece of it is a lot of companies aren't acknowledging this is a different kind of work, and we need to structure for that, and then have all of the kinds of things that we might have around that role that we would have around other kinds of roles that we have training and mentoring and all of that for. I think that's the first part. And the second part, Sarah sort of already alluded to as well, which is this kind of knowledge tends to be very compartmentalized in our industry, right? And so Sarah, on her own, can go off and build up this immense amount of expertise, and it's in Sarah's head. And the only way to get that knowledge out as a method of learning is to analyze your incidents, to learn from your incidents, and then to be very intentional about moving that information through the organization. And again, like Morgan said, even outward and upward to, sort of management, executive, and other team layers. So like, I think a big part of what's, challenging about that, and all those different methods, is each of them tends to be these little silos. And the way we don't really invest in just, distributing that learning and that knowledge more broadly outside of the team that does acquire that, however it is, that they do manage to scrap that through. So I'm not sure if I caught everything, that you wanted in there, Sarah, but that would be one of the challenges I think we have around all of the training type things, is acknowledging how unique this type of work is and building out around that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. Morgan, and if I've jumped ahead to something you wanted to cover later, feel free to pump me. But I think one of the things that's been interesting for me in watching you build out training programs is your ability to understand that we need to train to different levels. Are you open, like, do you want to speak to that a little bit here, both training to different levels and how we teach, and just like a brief recognition prime decision making and how we teach some of the pattern bits?
I mean, to kind of walk backwards from that, a lot of the RPD or recognition prime stuff really, I'm going to oversimplify this, but it's exposure, right? It's exposure to either different mental models that you can contrast against, like an expert, and then the key at that point is understanding how you came to your decision, how they did, and then that's where you can start building upon it there. But another part of it is repetition, learning from and the key part is learning from that repetition. If you're just doing the same thing over and over again, you're probably not going to recognize what's happening there. And the key part of that decision making is recognizing it. Another part of it is an example being there are different ways you do it if you have a dedicated response team versus if you're part of a site reliability team. The training's not going to look the same, and how you make those decisions isn't going to look the same. So when you're building out these training methods, the question then becomes, how is this going to be successful? And I list that example because my success criteria for people who have to balance this job will be different than dedicated people, because for like, just to highlight at a very broad level, for a dedicated incident response team, there may be more coordination training because you're leveraging different resource subsets. Whereas engineers who are doing both their day job and response may have more command training because of how to interact with people, how to resolve disputes, how to come to conclusions. So you've got to have that sort of area there. But a lot of it at the end of the day is, I've made a decision. How does this decision play out? And how do other people think about it? Because that not only allows you to contrast with an expert, but it allows you to understand how other people are thinking and anticipate them. So I would say at a very, again, broad level, that's kind of what you're looking at with RPD or other recognition techniques. Anything that I missed there that you wanted brought up?
Do you want to speak to kind of the teaching to different levels?
Oh, yeah, fair enough. So in my mind, there are, and I'm abstracting a lot of different stuff from a lot of different people, but at the end of the day, I generally tend to look when I train at people at three different levels. One is the introductory, or the beginner level, right? You're new to this company. You may not be new to technology, but new to the platform. And that's where things like run books, playlist, whatever you want to call them, come into understanding. Do you understand what our tools are, who the basic teams to reach out to? And like, that's the beginner set. And again, I think that's where a lot of training tends to stop, unfortunately. There is, however, what I call the intermediate expert step, where you start to encourage people to look at run books as a floor, not a ceiling. It's something that you start from, but then teaching them how to pivot off of that, how to look at what needs to be done in scenarios that really throw you off, and building those sorts of areas of resilience. And so you really start to again, adapt, right? So the first layer is learning the basics. The second layer is adapting. And I would say the actual expertise layer, when you become a true expert in this, is about innovating and expanding and looking at it and going, what are the fundamental areas we need to build upon? Where are we fundamentally having challenges to learn? Where are we successfully building organizational resilience and whatnot? So, I mean, again, it's highly broad, but I think there are three fundamental levels there. And if you want a robust training program, you need to understand how to address the beginners, how to address the intermediate or journey person expertise, and then how to actually grow and build real expertise. Because again, just because you're like, oh, I'm an expert in incident response doesn't mean you stop learning. It becomes much harder to learn. And so that requires more resources, more engagement, and it's fundamentally really expensive to do, but it's critical to do if you want a healthy program.
And I think what Morgan is talking about, like for me, as I have moved more into teaching and training and mentoring myself, like that's been one of the most critical realizations for me that I didn't necessarily recognize. And I keep talking about the law of fluency just because I think I've stubbed my toe on it so many times. But trying to remember the mindset that you were in when you were much earlier in your journey and how you teach to that. Is like one of the best, I think, practical tips I can give people, but also recognizing that if your training only stays there, then you potentially lose the ability to develop all of this expertise and really let people grow into a specialty.
Cool. So more on this topic in a minute. Let's just take a quick break to answer a question. So Brent Chapman's asked, Courtney, this one's for you. When you say that half of companies don't have a dedicated response team, do you mean a team that focuses primarily on responding themselves versus a team that's responsible for enabling others to respond by providing tooling, training, etc. for the rest of the org?
That's a really good question, Brent. And I don't have the answer to the second half of that question. That's not how we structured the survey. Always getting feedback on more information that we can include in that. And I'll just say these are like preliminary data from a survey that we're actively fielding right now. So, and I do think we have a bit of a skew in our data towards more advanced incident response companies, and as this broadens, that those numbers may change. So just I will issue the standard caveat there. What I've seen is that about half of the companies we talked to or have survey data from have indicated they have a specific team that's dedicated to incident response, and the other half is a mishmash of options. I will just say, and so. I can't answer the second half of the question. I'll make some notes about being able to potentially answer that question in the future. I hope that answered your question, Brent. And I just wanted to underscore one more thing that Sarah had said about how you enable more advanced, and more expert folks, and what that kind of training looks like, and what Morgan was talking about around like decision making under pressure in particular, and how those skills look really different. And I just like to go back. Actually, Sarah brought up biking, but I used to be a mountain biking coach. And there are in that world, and as in many other high skill worlds, incredibly detailed expert level training where people have gone in and broken down what that expertise is. What are the subcomponents of all of those things? How do I teach someone how to go around a corner? How do I teach someone to get their front wheel up? To how do I teach someone to like hit a huge jump in the air, right? The other worlds have figured this stuff out. What those skills look like are wildly different, obviously, in the world of software, but the investment in what those cognitive processes look like for experts is really important, and not something that the tech industry is terribly good at, I would argue. And so that's why folks try to bring in domains like what Morgan's talking about, sort of natural decision-making, these other kinds of things from other domains. How do people make decisions under pressure? How do they understand what the subcomponents of that knowledge look like? And I mean, I think, again, to a point Morgan made earlier, this stuff, it takes time and people and money. And companies have to decide that it's worth investing in. But it is possible. We have examples from so many other domains of where we could do this. So, I mean, I'm trying to be optimistic about that. And I have seen exemplars of that in certain companies and places where folks like Morgan and Sarah have worked. So it's not like we're all just completely lost about how to do this.
So, Courtney, you mentioned your Void survey there. So now is probably a good moment to let our viewers know that you're still looking for people to take your Void survey. So
I appreciate the plug, Stu. Yes, we are currently fielding a huge survey to try to understand exactly this situation and this conundrum that we have of what does incident response look like for the industry. I know what, like I say, the wizards do. I know what the Morgans and the Sarahs do. We really want to know what everyone else is doing. So thank you, Stu. I appreciate that. We can put a link in to that. I'll grab that and put that in the chat. Thank you.
Yeah, do the survey, everyone. It's worth your time. Absolutely. So we were talking there for a little bit about this balance between learning a process, maybe based around playbooks and runbooks, and sticking to a script, and learning to adapt. Where in your training and your learning do you find the balance between this? Because both of them are useful, absolutely, aren't they? Who wants to take this one?
I'll break the ice. So this is one of those areas where I think real world examples benefit as a cornerstone for learning, because that sort of surprise that requires you to adapt is fundamentally difficult to anticipate. I'm not going to be so cynical as to say impossible, but it's unlikely that you're going to call many of them out. And once you have an understanding of what that sort of fundamental surprise looks like that requires adaptation, you can talk to people after the incident and build it in the training about how come that was surprising, what surprised you about it, what made it difficult to handle. And you start to build this scaffolding on what the characteristics of a surprise can look like. And that can help you, if not necessarily anticipate them, build similar sorts of surprises. Because at that point, it's not necessarily that you're training people to handle a surprise that is going to happen in the real world. It's that you're training people to handle surprises. And once you accept that fundamental difference, and your training is built around building that capacity to adapt and not being measured upon how many accidents did you predict, you're usually going to be far more successful. Because if you keep trying to predict them, you're just going to keep walking into brick walls. So I'd say at a high level, that's the cornerstone of adaptation.
I think there's something important here as well about what you reward and recognize and punish in an organization is also going to change this behavior. And what I mean by that is, like, if you say everybody must stick exactly to the run book, and this gets into a little bit of like the work is imagined versus work is done and the disconnect there, which I will not rabbit hole on, even though I love that topic. But if you tell people that and people are quietly off to the side making adaptations and it's largely successful, and you're not looking at the work as it's actually done, you might not be recognizing that. And then eventually at some point in time, someone is going to make an adaptation that, and we touch on all these concepts of local rationality and there not being, human error and all that, but someone's going to make a decision that they're going to make in great faith, and it's going to make total sense at the time, and it's not going to turn out the way that they hope. And I always say, like, judgment is a time-stamped decision because you're working with the best that you have at the time. And if your organization has been disconnected from how much adaptation is happening, and comes down and says, well, that person should have followed the run book, this is, bad person, that sort of thing, people are going to go back to like, okay, I must do exactly what the run book says. And so I think you just have to you really have to make a choice. Like, how much do you trust your people and their expertise to let them adapt, and to recognize that largely that adaptation, and this goes into Richard's How Complex Systems Fail, but like largely that adaptation is going to be successful. There are times that it's not going to be successful. And if you punish people for decisions made in good faith, people are going to be hesitant to break out of a run book, even though largely we need some degree of adaptation, and particularly when you have experts in your system. So I think there's really a part of this that it's like you have to look at how much room you're giving people and how much autonomy you're giving people and what you're rewarding or not rewarding, and are people afraid to make mistakes or not. In How Complex Systems Fail, it talks about practitioner actions being gambles, and so are you willing to recognize that? And the one thing I'll say, and I know I've probably like baited both Morgan and Courtney on this, but the one thing I'll say is like, run books are great. They're a great foundation. There are certainly things that I run through my checklist because like that helps me cognitively offload stuff. And then there are places that I adapt as well. But I feel really confident about this. If you say like run books will save us, if we only follow the run book, everything will go smoothly. That is not how reality works in complex systems. I hate to break that to the world, but that is a false sense of safety. So who wants to jump in after I've, yeah, Courtney, go.
I'm like madly waiting to unmute. Y'all, when I do podcasts with Sarah, I'm dying because she immediately starts going where my brain was already going. So it's always really great fun. But she checked this thing earlier called the law of fluency, which is that experts, like we said, don't have access necessarily to that expertise. And one of the key hallmarks of that is that experts adapt. Experts have this intuition, hard earned over time with experience with a system, and they don't follow run books. They don't do the, guardrail things that you're supposed to. And you have to be okay with that because that is the nature of where adaptation comes from. And you have to be able to adapt in these, sort of tumultuous kinds of events. We're not all Captain Sully, but that's a great example of, I would argue, of somebody with insane amount of expertise in a system and has to make some pretty hard trade-offs and pretty crazy decisions under pressure. And so there are all of these cultural factors that do or don't support that. Again, that companies have to invest in that has nothing to do with the technology or the technical skills or any of that. And this is like an executive management level, sort of enablement of giving your people room to adapt, room to experiment, and knowing that those gambles will not always work, and being okay with that, because acknowledging that the vast majority of the time, those adaptations, those on the fly decisions, those things that those people do keep your stuff running. You just don't see that, right? That's part of what Sarah is saying. Part of the law of fluency is you don't even see all of that happening. And then there's a whole nother training level, I'm sure, for Morgan of gaining access to the fact that that happens and how do you allow people to do that, right? But it's like those people are playing jazz. They're not reading sheet music. And you have to be, as an organization, comfortable with allowing that and supporting that.
Yeah. So Courtney, talking about the law of fluency, and you touched on, higher level executives there. I imagine, lots of them will be thinking, like, what am I going to notice if this training, if this learning that is going on around incidents is actually working? What advice might you give to them? Because I think a lot of them will focus on the things that are easy to measure, and there are lots of things like that are easy to measure. And Courtney, you've spoken more than most people about MTTR and why that's not a really valid metric. What might you advise folks who are asking this question? What is it that we'll notice when people are getting better?
Yeah, I'll take a little bit of this and then I'll let Morgan and Sarah really go from their, sort of real experience with this. But you have to ask your people. Like, these are qualitative signals that you aren't going to get from incident counts or mean time to whatever, things that, and this is a fundamental disconnect in a lot of modern corporate environments. We want rolled up numbers, right, for folks at the top who don't have the time in their day to be able to be down in the trenches, understanding that we want rolled up numbers and the belief that somehow those rolled up numbers will give those people some kind of health check, right, on what's happening. But things like cognition, performance under pressure, all of these things, they don't track to sort of quantitative metrics, especially the ones that we're so used to seeing in a business environment. It doesn't mean you can't get that information, but it means you do actually have to ask the people doing the work, like, how's it going? And then I would argue the other piece you can look at is there are signals that that learning is happening. If you are analyzing your incidents, if you are trusting people to go back and look at what happened and be really thorough and really intentional about that, you can look at, is that information getting disseminated in your organization? Are people reading the incidents? Are those incident reports getting shared? Are they getting used in product planning meetings, in architectural discussions, in onboarding and training and those kinds of things? There are ways to get at this. They are just not ways that in, again, modern corporate culture, we are used to using. You are looking at, is learning happening? That is what you are trying to understand. And the current metrics that we have, for the most part, really don't even scratch the surface of what that looks like.
I'll go ahead and jump on that a little because Courtney hit some really awesome ones. And I have a fondness to generally try to address, again, the building blocks. If people are listening or wondering what sort of things they want to build, and I'm going to go ahead and point at Gary Klein again, where he made a good comment around what performance improvement is or what it looks like. And it's fundamentally a combination of error reduction and insight generation. And I think that one of the points he made that I agree with, especially in the tech sector, is we generally tend to focus way too much on error reduction and not nearly enough on insight generation. And so when people are evaluating that performance, yeah, it's like, okay, well, I think any program that's really successful in how you learn is going to be based on what are we learning and how are we applying that learning? And one other area I will point at, and I will dig this link up in a moment, is from Dr. Laura McGuire and her PhD thesis, which is around controlling the cognitive cost of coordination in large-scale distributed software systems. And one of the things that is just gold. Now, the entire paper is gold, but it's 155 pages or something like that. So it's going to take you a while. But one thing I will note that is really valuable is she breaks down like behaviors and tendencies of how organizations tend to adapt or control or break down from these coordination costs. And those, looking at those lists and her research can really help you look at how you're improving by looking at how those costs are being controlled and figuring out either through incident analysis or I think to a much lesser extent, but still possible on some level metrics, how are we improving this? How are people reaching out? Do they know where we're reaching out? Things like that. So I'd really encourage anyone who's trying to build this to take a look at both Klein's work on performance improvement and Laura McGuire's on that cost of coordination control.
I think the one thing I would say that hopefully I can say briefly, because I feel like I got a bit verbose on the last answer, is that I think there's a tendency to equate easy with good. And that is not the case in these messy, complex, novel incidents. Like, I think it's very easy, particularly if you're looking with a degree of hindsight bias, to say like, well, good was, this clear linear path and then they deviated off of it, or good was if the bridge seemed completely orderly at all times. And I know, like, for me as an incident commander, there are times that I choose to step away, not step away, but step back a little bit in my role, let the bridge have more free-form discussion. Like, there are times I call it like giving space, giving airtime to experts on the bridge to have more organic and less structured discussions. And so I think one of the things that I just really try to iterate, and either Stu or Morgan is going to have the quote better than I do, but there's either a Richard or John quote that talks about how do you tell the difference between a challenging incident managed well and a simple incident. But I would just, for anybody who's listening who is trying to understand progress, I would just really iterate or really like emphasize that, like, the incident feeling good or easy is like not necessarily the same thing. And the perfect example of this is if you, Stu was part of the drill that Alex and I did for, oh my gosh, Stu, what was the name of when we were all doing the multi-party dilemma drill for uptime?
It was Breaking Bears, I believe.
Breaking Bad. And I got off that drill, and the first thing I told to Stu was, that's the worst incident I've ever run in my life. And I went back and looked at it, and actually the incident was not my best, but it was, I would say, like easily the top 50%. The incident was totally fine. It felt very clunky to me because I was not familiar with the tools I was trying to use and the systems and all of these things. And it's so easy to get kind of internalized in, it didn't feel easy or good to me, therefore I didn't do a good job. And so I think there's something to really be aware of there. Courtney's like pointing, so I think with the like minute or two we have left, I should let Courtney or Morgan go loose on this one.
Go Morgan. I think you have a lot to say here. No? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm dying here because it's sort of the inverse of the law of fluency. It's that experts expect things to them to feel good when it's something they're good at. And if it doesn't feel good, that means it went horribly. And usually that just is like, God, lean into those, right? Like this again is, how do you introspect expertise? If something has friction, if something feels weird, if something, like, you've got to go figure out why was that the case, and then how do you make sure that other people are aware of what that was and why were those things true in that situation. That is gold right in there. That again, these are the feelings, these are the confidence, these are these qualitative things of expertise that I'm going to do this one more time, if you have a really skilled incident analyst at your company who has this whole other set of skills that are completely, like we talk about, like incident response is different from like your daily. This is a different ballgame. The people who know how to go in and analyze your incidents and pull out that expertise, pull out what the sources of friction were, pull out what the sources of success and all of these things are. That is, in my opinion, the single best investment you can make to understand how this expertise works and how to communicate that throughout your organization. But that is a very different job, the people who can come in and elicit that knowledge and that understanding. So hire incident analysts, y'all. They're worth it.
That's awesome, Courtney. Thank you so much. I think we're about out of time here. So let's start to wrap up. We got a comment there in the chat from Lauren, who's quoted you there, Sarah, which is a really nice way to close this off. You said there's a tendency to equate easy with good, and that's not the case in these messy, complex incidents. So thank you so much, Courtney, Morgan, and Sarah, for sharing your expertise with me and the audience online and all of our future audience in the recordings. I really appreciate it. We've had a really wonderful conversation today, covering a huge range of topics around learning how to be a more effective incident responder. So thanks everyone for attending. You'll see a slide that's up there right now with a QR code. If you take a photo of that QR code, that will take you to the Uptime Labs website. If you're interested in learning how to be a better incident responder for yourself or for your organization, we would absolutely love to talk to you. So there we go. Thank you, everyone. And we'll hopefully see you soon. Bye-bye.